No one knows the whole truth, not even parents, about this harsh yet sweet childhood secret. At the beginning of the movie, we meet a doctor named Igor Belov, who is preparing to identify the body of his son Vanya in the morgue. He reminisces about happy moments in life before the tragedy and the day when he and his wife Polina, a teacher, last let Vanya go out to play. Igor gave his son his father's watch and explained when he should return home. However, Vanya never came back. Seeing the mutilated body of the boy, Igor realizes that it's not his Vanya. To the confusion of investigator Igorov and the morgue workers, Igor claims that this boy looks very much like his son, but he doesn't have the defect on his right foot that Vanya had. Igorov insists that Igor take a closer look at the body, but he insists that he would surely recognize his son. 3 years have passed. Igor and Polina Belov still can't come to terms with the loss of Vanya and decide to adopt a child to fill the void in their lives. They arrive at an old children's shelter run by nuns. Polina immediately notices a dark window in the wing, but her husband distracts her, and they head inside the building. However, it turns out that someone is indeed in the wing. Meanwhile, Sister Isadora leads them to a room with many infants. While Polina tries to hold herself together at the sight of the little children, reminiscent of her son, Igor is already getting acquainted with a boy named Elisha. He picks him up and shows him to Polina, but she runs out of the shelter in fear. Coming to her senses, she looks again at the wing's window and decides to take a look inside. Seeing nothing, she decides to enter the wing through the door. In the dark abandoned room, she discovers a seriously wounded man and notices a strange creature, resembling a child, running out of the room. The police arrive at the shelter. Investigator Anapov is convinced that the man, who turned out to be the shelter's guard, took his own life. However, it's still unknown who the child with him in the basement was and where he disappeared to. The shelter's supervisor assures Anapov and the Belovs that this child is not one of theirs, as their children were under supervision. Igor can't believe that none of the orphans saw or heard anything, and the supervisor admits that among the children there are rumors that undead from the cemetery roam near the shelter. However, the nun is convinced that these are just ordinary children's scary stories. Soon, Polina is distracted from the conversation and notices a group of children teasing another child. She shoos away the surrounding kids and decides to comfort the poor boy. Even though the boy looks and behaves extremely strangely and creepily, Polina doesn't seem to notice it. Later, doctors try to examine the wild child, and Anapov asks the supervisor to take the child into their shelter until they find his parents. But the nun says it's impossible because the child has a psychological trauma, and they don't have specialists for such children. Hearing this conversation, Polina says they are willing to take the child with them, especially since their country house is nearby. The supervisor warns that he needs special care, but Polina assures that they will provide him with everything he needs. However, Anapov informs them that he'll be taken to a specialized facility first, and Polina says goodbye to the withdrawn boy. Igor clearly isn't thrilled about the idea of his wife taking in this strange child, but he doesn't say anything. As he exits the shelter, Sister Isadora urges him to take anyone but this child. However, he doesn't take her words seriously and says they probably won't be allowed to take him anyway. On the way home, Polina suddenly spots the child on the road and asks her husband to stop. She rushes out of the car and embraces the eerie child, who mysteriously escaped from the police, then convinces Igor to take him home. At home, Polina enthusiastically starts arranging the room for their foster son, but Igor asks her not to get attached to him since they took him illegally. Soon, Igor hears a strange noise and the cat cries from the second floor and goes to check if everything is fine. Polina rushes to the child and begins to calm him down. Igor hears his wife calling the child Vanya, just like their missing son, and he's very unhappy about it. The next day, Igor finds the child in the pantry, gnawing on a toy like a wild animal. He tries to take the toy away and pull him out of the pantry, but the child aggressively breaks free, and Igor raises his hand against him. The child hides under the couch, noticed by Polina. She accuses her husband of scaring Vanya and once again sets about comforting the boy. Meanwhile, investigator Anapov arrives and informs them that the boy has run away. He asks if the Belovs have seen him, but Igor insists they haven't. Before leaving, Anapov says he knows the child is with the Belovs but claims he's on their side and will try to help them with custody. But Igor declares they don't need any help. Later, Igor invites a familiar psychotherapist, Vasilyev. After examining the child, he reveals that the boy is severely malnourished and developmentally delayed. Despite looking no older than 6, he should actually be around 9 years old. Vasilyev suggests seeking help from specialists, but Polina is reluctant to take him to doctors, believing that the child is fine and they can handle him on their own. At night, Polina has a horrifying dream in which she sees her missing son Vanya, disfigured with huge scars. The next day, Igor can't find their cat anywhere, but Polina doesn't seem to be concerned. She assumes it just ran off and continues to care for the little wild child without a worry. Then they go for a walk, and it seems Igor is starting to get used to the boy. In the evening, they return home, and Igor once again calls for the cat with no luck. However, they discover the gnawed body of the animal right under their house, and it's clear that their foster son is behind it. At night, Igor and Polina make love, while the boy peeks at them. In the morning, Polina prepares breakfast for the child, but he unexpectedly runs away from home. Polina rushes after him and soon sees him standing by the road with a woman. However, when she gets closer, the woman disappears. Igor tells Detective Antipov about the incident, suspecting that the boy's real mother might have approached him. He also asks for permission to take the boy to their apartment in Moscow, and Antipov agrees, as the search for his parents has yielded no results. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the beloved's neighbors, Tatyana and Petr Makarov, return home late at night. Suddenly, the new Vanya runs onto the road after a ball, and the Makarovs almost hit him. Not noticing this, Polina approaches Vanya and takes him into the house. She greets the neighbors and informs them that they have already returned from the country house. The next day at breakfast, Vanya doesn't seem as wild as before, but he still doesn't speak. During the day, Polina talks to Igor on the phone and shares her concerns that the boy lacks interaction with peers. While talking, she searches for Vanya hiding around the apartment and suddenly, out of fear, she drops the phone, and Igor starts worrying that something happened. But a couple of seconds later, Polina casually tells him that Vanya is just fooling around. A few days later, Igor takes Vanya to the playground and asks the boys to play with him. The boys see that something is wrong with Vanya, but still try to start a conversation and ask for his name. But Vanya just stares at them with a heavy gaze and continues to stay silent. This annoys the kids, and they snatch the ball from him, calling him a zombie. But then Vanya's face changes, his eyes roll back, and he suddenly attacks the bully, biting his neck. Soon the police arrive at the Beloveds. Igor decides to hide his wife and Vanya in the bathroom, saying they've gone to the countryside. Igor is informed that the injured boy received 15 stitches and that Vanya is very aggressive, so he should be placed in a specialized institution. Meanwhile, Polina cautiously comes out of the bathroom to eavesdrop on their conversation, leaving Vanya alone. Igor bribes the police to leave their family alone, and they only warn him to draw conclusions from this incident before leaving. Finally, Polina wants to let the boy out but realizes he has locked himself in. Igor breaks down the door, and the shocked parents see Vanya banging his head against the edge of the bathtub. The Beloveds calm down the frenzied child, treat the wound, and put him to bed. Before leaving his room, Igor notices one of his drawings on the floor. It clearly alarms Igor, and he takes it with him. Then he searches through one of the drawers for a long time and finally finds almost the same drawing, drawn by their missing son. Some time later, Polina cuts the adopted Vanya's hair, and then looks in the mirror with him. However, instead of him, she sees her biological son in horror in the reflection. Later, she organizes a home celebration for the new Vanya's birthday, scheduling it on the same day as their biological son's. Polina brings out the cake with lit candles, and the fire terrifies the boy horribly. Memories of a terrible fire flash before his eyes. The boy angrily knocks the cake off the table, and Polina rushes to calm him down. Suddenly, she declares that this boy is their Vanya. Igor tries to prove that this child cannot be their son. Angry, Polina states that if he doesn't believe it and starts calling him Vanya, she will leave him. The next day, Igor meets with the therapist, Vasilyev, and tells him that his wife has convinced herself that their son has returned. Vasilyev doesn't find it strange and says that this fantasy helps her cope with grief. But Igor doesn't think losing touch with reality is normal. Igor also mentions that the boy seems to deliberately behave like their son and shows him similar drawings. Vasilyev also begins to lean towards the idea that this is their Vanya, drastically changed due to some trauma. Then the boy is sent for an MRI. He starts to struggle and emit terrifying screams, disrupting the equipment, and suddenly Igor sees his biological son in his place. Vasilyev advises Igor to learn more about the boy's past to uncover the truth. Igor heads to the orphanage and wants to learn more from Sister Isadora about the mysterious caretaker, but she doesn't share anything interesting, only suggesting to baptize the child. Disappointed, Igor is about to leave but then decides to sneak into the cottage where the caretaker lived. Carefully examining the room, Igor soon finds a hidden newspaper clipping from '97 with an article about the heroic act of Pavel Kamurov, the very caretaker. Suddenly, Igor is discovered by Isadora, who tells him he shouldn't be there and shouldn't dig into someone else's past. He asks her again about the child and the caretaker, but the nun, unwilling to reveal the truth, simply suggests returning the child. Igor goes to investigator Antipov and asks about the incident described in the article. Antipov tells him that once the owner of an old country house near the forest, in a drunken stupor, locked himself in and set the house on fire. He perished before the firefighters arrived, but the caretaker Kamurov rescued a child from the flames and temporarily housed him in the orphanage. However, what happened to that child afterward? No one knows. Nevertheless, Anapov promises to search for information about him in the archives. In the evening, Igor returns home, and Polina joyfully tells him that she's pregnant, although doctors previously claimed she couldn't have children anymore. The next day, Polina and Vanya go to the doctor. On the staircase landing, Polina briefly loses sight of the boy and then hears a strange, muffled sound. Worriedly calling out to Vanya, she suddenly finds their frightened neighbor Tatiana, whom he pushed down the stairs. Polina wants to help her, but the shaken woman runs away without saying anything. During the ultrasound, Polina is informed that she is likely having another boy. She tells Vanya that he'll soon have a little brother and suggests looking at the screen, but the equipment can't withstand the ominous gaze of the child. The thought of a brother doesn't please Vanya, and the doctor is convinced he's just jealous, and then hands Polina the first snapshot of her baby. In the evening, Polina struggles to find the ultrasound photo, then discovers it's been cut into small pieces. Realizing it's Vanya's doing, she goes to his room, but this time, there's no trace of her usual calm and kindness. Polina shouts at him and grabs his hand, trying to put him in a corner. However, enraged, Vanya's demeanor changes, and he bites Polina's hand. She retaliates, and just then Igor returns home. The boy immediately runs to him, playing the victim, while Polina tries to regain her composure after what happened. Igor and Polina switch positions in their relationship with the child. Now Polina wants to thoroughly examine Vanya to make sure he's not dangerous, while Igor accuses her of wanting to get rid of him and insists that everything's fine. But Polina admits she's afraid of this child and that he can't be their Vanya, because their Vanya wouldn't be capable of such cruelty. Suddenly, they realize the child has been eavesdropping all this time. Igor goes to his room and explains to him that he doesn't need to resemble their Vanya for them to love him. They'll love him just the way he is. One day, during a walk, the new Vanya tries to knock Polina off her scooter, but Igor stops him in time. Polina asks for him to be punished, as he intentionally rode straight at her, but Igor thinks the child was just playing around. Later, Igor comes home and can't find Vanya. Polina convinces him that Anapov took Vanya, claiming to have found the boy's mother, and that Isadora agreed to keep him at the orphanage. However, Igor doesn't believe her, suspecting she got rid of the boy herself. Meanwhile, Anapov takes the child to the orphanage. Suddenly, the boy takes on the appearance of the investigator's mother. Anapov loses control out of fear and veers off into a ditch. Igor tries to reach Anapov and drives along the same road. Soon he arrives at the accident scene and rushes to the car, hoping to find Vanya. The police push him away and say there are no children here. Then he notices a folder from the archives near the wrecked car and secretly takes it. Back in his car, Igor goes through the documents, and suddenly a whole and unharmed Vanya calls out to him from the backseat. He brings him home, then heads to the orphanage where he asks the children to tell him everything they know about the caretaker. They lead him to a hiding place and show him a video of a deranged woman, claiming it's Lena, the caretaker's late wife. Igor realizes the woman's behavior is very similar to their adopted sons, but they're interrupted by sister Isadora. Comparing the archive materials and the video, Igor concludes that Lena is Isadora's sister and that she's actually alive. He's certain that Lena and the caretaker hid her, and she gave birth to the boy they adopted. That's why Isadora didn't want him taken away. Realizing that further hiding the truth is pointless, Isadora decides to take Igor to Lena's grave in the forest. She explains that Lena has been dead for 20 years and has nothing to do with what's happening now in their lives. But Igor doesn't believe her and says Lena once tried to steal their child. Isadora confesses it was her and then hands him the same newspaper from '97 with a photo showing their adopted son, the one the caretaker saved. Igor understands that they can't be the same child, but Isadora claims it's not a child at all, it's something without gender, age, or soul. Igor thinks it's nonsense and leaves, but the nun continues to explain that this entity doesn't age or grow, it just reincarnates. It reflects human memories of loss, taking on the appearance of deceased relatives. And since Isadora doesn't feel the pain of loss, the entity refused to go with her when she tried to take it from the beloveds. The nun also warns that aggression towards it is forbidden, and it senses when someone wants to get rid of it and doesn't forgive that. Meanwhile, Polina is at home alone with the dangerous entity. During lunch, she feels a strange object in her mouth and retrieves a needle that the boy placed there. While she regains consciousness in the bathroom, the child tries to attack her again, but she manages to shut the door in front of him. It begs her to let it in, but Polina ignores it, and suddenly, soon Igor returns home and finds Polina seriously injured. Doctors try to save her life, but the chances of success are slim. With her last strength, Polina begs Igor to get rid of this entity. Hearing this, the boy runs away, and Igor chases after him. Soon the entity arrives home and knocks on the neighbor's door. Peter opens it, and it takes his life, then demands from Tatiana to return Vanya's watch. Then it returns to its apartment and hands Igor the same watch that Vanya wore on his last day. Then the bodies of the Makarovs are carried out of the neighbor's apartment, and Igor meets investigator Yegorov again, who reveals the truth about the disappearance of their Vanya. It turns out, the Makarovs accidentally hit their son and hid the body. The recording device with the tragic moment was kept in their safe and was found during the search. In the evening, Igor gives the child a sedative and takes him to the orphanage. Together with Isadora, they tie him to the bed and lock him in the room. When the entity wakes up and tries to break free, they watch as its appearance changes, reflecting someone's mourned losses. Isadora is convinced that this entity comes to people as a test. However, unlike Igor, the caretaker couldn't pass it. Igor is about to leave when he suddenly hears Polina's voice coming from the room. She couldn't survive the entity's attack after all. After some time, Vasilyev comes to Igor's home. He says he couldn't reach him and started to worry. But Igor grimly states that it's better for him to leave. Vasilyev apologizes for not attending Polina's funeral, as he didn't want to see her in a coffin, but Igor doesn't want to listen to him and shuts the door in his face. Vasilyev decides to peek into the house through the crack and suddenly sees a living Polina inside. Now the eerie otherworldly entity has taken her form, and Igor doesn't want to part with it. Do you think Igor will be able to endure this new trial? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.